The forest simulation on the Academy's outer moon began with the low hum of atmospheric projectors warming to life, spreading a green haze across the vast training valley. The mixed squad of cadets stood on the landing platform in a loose semicircle, still adjusting their tactical packs and sensory visors as the simulation dome sealed overhead. The air smelled of resin, cold soil, and the characteristic metallic hint of the Academy's artificial ecosystems. The instructor, Commander Serac, stood tall on a raised platform with his antennae held rigid, a sign that he expected immediate silence. He scanned the faces of the cadets, pausing for a brief moment when his gaze crossed the lone human in the group, Elias Ward. Elias rested with one hand on the strap of his pack, the other loosely at his side, expression unreadable as usual. Commander Serac's voice echoed sharply across the clearing. He announced that the squad would face a superior enemy force programmed to track, flank, and corner them with no possibility of open confrontation. He emphasized that this trial measured obedience, survival strategy, and discipline, not heroics. The entire squad was ordered to hide and avoid direct engagement at all costs. The success metric was not measured in kills or tactical advantage, but in remaining unseen until the extraction window opened in 6 hours. Serac repeated this 3 times, ensuring no cadet misunderstood the rule. He reminded them that combat would only lead to failure and that the simulation's enemy would adapt rapidly to any confrontation. The cadets listened with growing tension, some shifting nervously, some whispering among themselves about the difficulty of hiding from an adaptive enemy force. Elias stood motionless, watching the holographic map projected above the platform. His eyes tracked the simulation's enemy markers as they moved along the artificial terrain. He already knew the terrain would shift unpredictably once the simulation began. He also knew that the enemy force would sweep the forest with a pattern designed to flush out even the best-trained cadets. Hiding would not save anyone beyond the first hour. The alien cadets beside him, especially the thin-scaled Drelth cadet named Ral, seemed convinced that the safest plan was to press themselves into the undergrowth and stay completely silent until extraction. Ral whispered to another cadet that the human would be the first to break formation or panic, since humans lacked chameleon skin or scent-dampening glands. Elias heard the remark, but he did not react, keeping his focus on the map. The platform trembled as the simulation countdown began. 10 seconds until deployment. The forest shimmered around the squad as the artificial sky darkened into a deep emerald hue. The cadets tightened their straps and crouched slightly in anticipation of the launch field. Elias lowered his head, exhaling slowly to steady his heartbeat. He did not intend to reveal his concerns before the trial started. He knew the enemy force would sweep in a wide arc from the west, cutting the valley into isolated pockets. If the squad followed the instructor's order without thinking critically, the entire group would be discovered and cornered before the extraction craft even reached orbit. The ground beneath the squad split open into glowing hexagonal platforms that shot downward, carrying each cadet through a slide-like shaft and into the heart of the forest. Elias landed on a cushion of moss near the base of a broad, knotted tree, its bark lined with tiny bioluminescent spores. The moment his boots touched the ground, the simulation registered him as active, and the forest responded with a soft pulse. Distant sounds of wildlife echoed through the valley. The high-pitched whirls of simulated insects, the muffled thumps of predator simulations prowling far away, and the faint rustling of leaves shifted by the wind projectors overhead. The forest was alive, but the life inside it was an illusion, crafted for danger and disorientation. Commander Serac's voice came through the squad's internal comms one final time, reminding everyone that hiding was the only acceptable strategy. Then the channel cut out, replaced by a quiet static that signaled the beginning of the real evaluation. Elias looked around, noting how most cadets immediately scattered to find hiding spots. Ral leaped onto a low branch and wrapped himself in leaves that matched the color of his scales. Another cadet burrowed under a mound of ferns, believing her scent-dampening glands would hide her completely. Elias watched briefly, then turned away. He knew hiding would only give the enemy clearer targets. The enemy force in the simulation was designed to detect heat signatures, movement disturbances, and airborne scent trails. Hiding without misdirection meant the squad would be found one by one. He considered his options, scanning the forest for terrain features that could buy time or create blind zones. A cluster of fallen logs lay to the east, partially covered in fungus. A narrow creek wound toward a rocky incline. The air carried a slight magnetic distortion, a sign that the forest's dynamic traps were active but dormant until triggered. Elias adjusted the strap of his pack and started walking deeper into the forest. He did not run, did not hesitate, and did not inform the others of his departure. He had no obligation to contradict the instructor's order verbally. The others believed he intended to hide like the rest of them. He moved with quiet steps, placing his feet only on solid ground to avoid leaving visible impressions in the soft soil. The deeper he went, the quieter the forest seemed, as if the simulation sensed his intention and adjusted itself to him. The faint hum of the enemy's scanning devices grew in the distance, signaling that the patrol was already deployed. Elias knew he had limited time before the enemy's forward scouts reached the center of the valley. He also knew that if he stayed with the group, the entire squad would be discovered together, and the simulation would end with a recorded mass failure. He had no desire to watch that happen. He also had no intention of fighting openly. He would obey the instructor's rule in spirit, not fighting directly, but he would not let the simulation dictate the outcome. If he could manipulate the environment, redirect the enemy, and unsettle the patrol without confrontation, the squad might survive long enough to be extracted, and if the instructor disapproved, the simulation logs would speak for him. As he vanished into the deeper shadows of the forest, the sounds of the enemy grew sharper. A faint, rhythmic thumping indicated the approach of an armored scout unit. Elias crouched behind a fallen branch, listening to the metallic clicks echoing through the foliage. He understood the timing, the movement pattern, and the inevitable sweep. His mind began assembling possibilities, mapping the forest mentally, calculating where pressure points existed and how disturbances could be used to create false trails or misdirect the patrol. He adjusted his breathing, calming himself for the hours ahead. By the time the first enemy scout reached the outer ring of the valley, Elias had already disappeared completely from the squad's imagined hiding formation. No cadet knew where he had gone. No one had seen him slip away. The forest swallowed him, leaving behind nothing but silence and the faint impression that he had simply obeyed the order to hide, just not in the way anyone expected. The deeper Elias moved into the forest, the more the world behind him faded into a distant layer of muffled sound and shifting shadows. The forest simulation expanded around him with deliberate complexity, its artificial canopy weaving tightly enough to filter the emerald light into narrow beams. Each step drew him farther from the clearing where the other cadets had scattered themselves. He kept his pace steady, his breathing quiet and controlled, as he pushed toward the denser zones where the simulation's environmental distortions grew less predictable. His intention was clear. He needed distance, silence, and the kind of terrain variation that could be used as cover for movements no algorithm would expect from a human cadet. Behind him, the cadets remained convinced that he was somewhere nearby, hidden in the brush. Rahl believed he had heard Elias shift into the undergrowth toward the west, although the faint rustling he had heard had been nothing more than a breeze passing through layered leaves. Other cadets reassured themselves that the human's lack of biological camouflage would force him to choose the simplest hiding spot possible, and the assumption made them comfortable enough to settle into waiting. The squad fell into a tense stillness, unaware that Elias was moving in the opposite direction entirely, carving a silent path toward the forest's interior. The moment he crossed the thin creek that cut through the valley floor, the ambient noise changed. The forest's programmed wildlife sounds faded, replaced by a low, nearly imperceptible vibration generated by the simulation's deeper structural systems. Elias paused and pressed his hand lightly to a tree trunk, feeling the subtle rhythmic pulses moving through it. He recognized the pattern from earlier training. It was the sign of the enemy patrol's scanning grid expanding. The enemy force was already approaching the valley center. He knew the patrol would sweep in a layered wedge formation, using heat signatures, scent analysis, and motion distortion to detect any living presence. The cadets hiding in plain foliage would be found quickly unless something disrupted the enemy's pattern. He continued forward until the air cooled slightly, indicating that he was entering a zone shielded by dense terrain algorithms. Here, the foliage thickened, the ground sloped unevenly, and fallen logs formed natural barriers that blocked clear lines of movement. He crouched beside a cluster of tangled roots and studied his surroundings. Several large boulders protruded from the earth like ancient teeth, their surfaces covered with moss and small glowing spores that flickered softly with every vibration in the air. The terrain was perfect for what he needed, a space that offered angles, elevation, and natural objects that could be manipulated without drawing suspicion from the simulation's sensors. As he observed the environment, a distant metallic clatter echoed faintly across the forest. He recognized the sound immediately. The enemy patrol's forward drones were adjusting their altitude. Elias closed his eyes for a moment, focusing on the rhythm of the drone's movement. He counted 4 separate units, each scanning overlapping paths. He understood the spacing and the distance by the pitch of the hum. The drones were programmed to move ahead of the main enemy force, sweeping the forest for active body heat and rapid breathing patterns. The cadets hiding in shallow pits or beneath vegetation would soon be exposed. Elias lowered himself onto the ground, pressing his ear against the soil. The vibrations confirmed his earlier suspicion. The drones were fanning out. The main patrol units were not far behind. The enemy commander would soon detect the cluster of alien cadets who remained near the starting point. He needed to move quickly. He rose to his feet and shifted deeper into the thicket, slipping between roots and rocks with fluid movements. He avoided stepping on loose branches or moist leaves that would leave behind impressions. His intention was not simply to hide. He needed to become untraceable. As he reached a narrow corridor of trees, he paused again to reassess his surroundings. A fallen log lay across the path, half suspended by its remaining roots. Above it, 2 broad branches extended horizontally, weighed down by clusters of thick leaves and spores. He studied the arrangement with focused attention. The forest offered countless variables he could use. Nothing needed to be built. Everything already existed. He only had to understand how to move, shift, or disturb the environment in ways the simulation would not interpret as human-made traps. He pushed his palm lightly against the suspended log to test its weight distribution. The log swayed gently, responding with a groaning noise that blended seamlessly with the natural ambience of the forest. The sound of approaching footsteps, heavy, synchronized, metallic, pulled his attention sharply to the right. The enemy's first ground unit was closing in. Elias backed away just far enough to conceal himself behind a large tree trunk, though he kept himself ready to move. The enemy unit appeared between the trees, a humanoid figure of polished alloy and reinforced plating, its visor glowing faint amber as it scanned the environment. The unit paused, pivoted slightly, and released a soft pulse of heat detection into the air. The wave passed through the clearing and brushed lightly across Elias's position. He exhaled very slowly, lowering his pulse and tightening his muscles to reduce movement. The wave passed without registering him. The unit took another step forward, unaware that Elias was only a few meters away. Another drone floated behind the unit, its scanning frequency shifting as it detected several heat signatures farther west, where the cadets remained hidden. Elias understood what the scans had found: the overlapping shapes of multiple alien bodies pressed into the earth and foliage. The enemy unit took a sudden turn, adjusting its path toward the cluster. Elias watched in silence, knowing the patrol's attention needed to be diverted before the group was discovered. He waited for the right moment. The unit stepped under the fallen log. A small cluster of leaves above it shifted with the breeze, and the suspended log swayed slightly. Elias moved silently, rolling a small stone with the tip of his boot. The stone tapped lightly against the log's exposed root. The sound was faint, but precise. The log shifted, and the spore clusters above dropped in a flurry, releasing a haze of bioluminescent powder that drifted into the enemy unit's visor. The powder created a momentary distortion in the scanner's readings. The unit stopped abruptly, recalibrating its vision, and the drone behind it adjusted its altitude to compensate. The sensor grid flickered. This was all Elias needed. He slipped around the tree trunk and vanished deeper into the forest, continuing his silent journey away from the cadets and the enemy. He maintained his rhythm, each step calculated to minimize impact. He did not leave broken twigs or obvious disturbances behind him. He remained a ghost within the forest, unseen and unheard. The patrol unit, now disoriented by the spore haze, redirected its scan elsewhere, allowing the cadets an unintended reprieve. As he increased the distance between himself and the others, the forest grew darker and more complex. The simulation algorithms intensified the distortion zones, generating slight shifts in wind, temperature, and light. Elias welcomed the additional complexity. It offered more opportunities to disappear entirely. By the time the enemy patrol regained its scanning rhythm, Elias had already passed through the threshold of the inner valley, where the terrain formed natural hallways and blind spots. No cadet saw where he went. No footprint remained to follow. No sound betrayed his direction. To the squad, he had simply vanished. To the enemy, he did not exist. And to the simulation's sensors, he blended perfectly into the forest's pattern of natural disturbances. He had not hidden in the traditional sense. He had stepped outside the expected boundaries of the trial, turning the forest into his own silent shield. Far behind him, the cadets remained unaware of how close the enemy patrol had come. They believed the forest was quieter than expected, unaware that Elias had already begun reshaping the battlefield long before the first confrontation. Elias moved through the forest with a precision that would have been impossible for any cadet who relied on instinct alone. Every sound, every shift in the airflow, every faint vibration beneath his boots carried information about the simulation's environment. The deeper he went, the more he noticed how the terrain subtly guided movement in certain directions. The forest was designed to funnel cadets toward safe zones or predetermined vantage points, but those same guiding principles applied to the enemy patrol as well. The simulation architects believed that cadets would hide and wait while the enemy followed a predictable sweep. Elias understood that if he wanted to disrupt the patrol's formation without engaging in direct combat, he needed to work with those natural funnels. He needed to let the forest do most of the work for him. He stopped beside a cluster of thick roots that wound across the ground like petrified serpents. Above him, broad-leafed branches drooped under the weight of vibrant spores, each glowing with a faint blue hue that pulsed in rhythm with the shifting habitat algorithms. Elias crouched and studied the arrangement. The roots formed a natural choke point, narrow enough to guide anything approaching from the northwest into a single-file path. The low-hanging branches created a canopy that forced tall enemy units to bend slightly to pass under them. The simulation designers had intended these features to create a dramatic tunnel-like effect for environmental storytelling. Elias saw something else entirely, an opportunity to manipulate movement and timing. He scanned the area for loose stones, brittle branches, any material that could be shifted subtly without creating unnatural patterns. His hand located a dry branch half buried under leaves. He lifted it carefully, testing its weight. The branch was stiff enough to spring when pressure was released, but not thick enough to resemble constructed equipment. He wedged it between two roots so that it remained under tension. The moment an enemy unit stepped on the correct patch of moss, the branch would snap upward and send a burst of spores into the patrol's visual receptors. The spores would distort the unit's scanners just long enough to break formation. He heard movement in the distance, heavy, organized, metallic. The enemy patrol was changing direction. He knew the earlier disruption had forced the patrol commander to reevaluate the search pattern. The drone's hum grew louder, more deliberate, and the forest responded by tightening its background sounds. The simulation always tried to assist its programmed enemy units when it detected irregularities. But no amount of algorithmic rebalancing could compensate for physical disturbances hidden in the environment itself. Elias moved on, carefully navigating a ridge where the earth dipped sharply. He crouched low, the ridge offering concealment while he assessed the area below. Several large logs lay scattered across the ground, remnants of simulated storm damage. Their bark had peeled, leaving pale wood exposed. A fallen trunk had landed diagonally across two boulders, forming a crude fulcrum. Elias stepped closer, testing its balance with 2 fingers. It shifted slightly, resting with most of its weight on the lower stone. The slightest push from above would send the trunk rolling downhill. He did not intend to build a trap in the traditional sense. He simply positioned existing elements so that the forest's own dynamics would take over. He placed a small cluster of stones atop the upper end of the trunk. To an enemy unit walking along the ridge, it would look like nothing more than scattered debris. But when the unit stepped on the ridge, the vibration would travel downward, causing the stones to roll and the trunk to collapse in a controlled slide. The rolling trunk would disrupt the unit's stability, forcing it to stop and brace, interrupting its search pattern and slowing the entire group behind it. Satisfied, Elias moved deeper into the inner valley, where the forest grew darker. The trees here were massive, their roots twisting together to create arches and tunnels. The air felt thicker and damper, carrying a subtle metallic undertone that hinted at the simulation's central systems buried beneath the terrain. This was where the most complex environmental behaviors occurred, because the simulation continuously adjusted the temperature, wind direction, and humidity to create a more immersive experience. Elias found the perfect location. A narrow corridor formed naturally by 2 massive trees leaning toward one another. The space between them allowed only a single unit to pass at a time. Moss-covered rocks lined the ground, and several loose vines hung from the trees above. He examined the vines, testing each one with a gentle pull. Some were attached firmly, integrated into the simulation's structural logic. Others were loose, serving purely decorative purposes. He selected 2 of the loose vines and pulled them lightly to test their elasticity. Then he laid one across the ground, partially hidden by leaves, while he anchored the other higher in the branches, weaving it between natural growth so that it blended into the canopy. The forest would complete the illusion for him. When an enemy unit stepped into the corridor, its motion would disturb the lower vine, transferring the movement upward. The upper vine, tightened by the shift, would snap downward with enough force to release a cascade of seeds and dust from the overhead foliage. To the simulation's sensors, it would look like wind-triggered plant behavior, not a trap set by a cadet. He stepped back, evaluating the alignment. The timing would be perfect. The dust would blind the unit briefly, forcing it to halt. The narrow corridor would block the units behind it, creating a chain reaction of delayed movement that would disrupt the entire patrol's progression. Suddenly, the distant forest trembled. A deep, resonant thump reverberated through the earth, the kind produced by enemy reinforcements deploying additional ground units. Elias stiffened slightly, listening carefully. The new units would be heavier than the scouts and drones, and their formation would be more aggressive. The patrol commander clearly believed the earlier interference came from environmental malfunctions or the presence of multiple cadets working together. The new ground units would move in a tight phalanx, focusing on overwhelming any hiding spot the drones flagged. Elias continued forward, adjusting his pace. He avoided open ground and sought elevated platforms formed by thick roots or low branches. The elevated vantage allowed him to see the faint glow of the enemy's searchlights slicing through the distant foliage. The lights moved methodically, sweeping in slow arcs. The enemy was moving faster than he expected, advancing deeper into the valley. He reached a clearing bordered by tall reeds that swayed with an artificial breeze. The center of the clearing held a natural dip filled with soft soil. Elias knelt beside the dip and scanned the area. He spotted a collection of thick branches partially buried beneath the reeds. He lifted one and turned it in his hands. It was heavy enough to serve as a lever. He placed it back and adjusted the reeds around it, creating a visual barrier that looked untouched. Then he shifted a rock near the clearing's edge so that when the first patrol unit stepped on it, the weight distribution would collapse the soil in the dip and send the unit dropping into a shallow pit. The pit would not injure the unit, but it would force the patrol to slow down and reevaluate its route. Elias wiped soil from his fingers and glanced toward the treetops. A faint red shimmer reflected against the leaves, the unmistakable glow of the forward drone scanners sweeping toward his position. He moved quickly but silently, slipping into the tall reeds on the opposite side of the clearing. The drone passed overhead, its sensors flickering as it detected faint traces of movement patterns. But Elias had already positioned himself behind a thick root cluster that masked his heat signature long enough for the drone to drift away. The forest's atmosphere shifted again, signaling that the enemy units were entering the zones he had prepared. He listened, hearing the series of small disruptions unfolding in sequence. A subtle snap of a branch, a burst of spores, a startled mechanical whir, a muffled thud as a unit stumbled, the scrape of metal as a formation broke. The patrol's rhythm was unraveling. Elias moved on, confident that he had reshaped the battlefield just enough to tilt the balance. The forest was no longer a static environment. It had become a trap field awakened by his deliberate choices, subtle, natural, and invisible to the simulation's oversight. The enemy would soon be forced into the clearing ahead, exactly where he wanted them. He continued forward, ready to shape the next stage of the silent battle unfolding behind him. Elias approached the final clearing with slow, measured steps, keeping his body low as he moved beneath a half-collapsed arch of roots. The forest ahead opened into a broad, circular space where the artificial light dimmed into a pale green glow, creating long shadows that flickered with every shift of the canopy. Thick branches jutted overhead like the ribs of an ancient creature, and the air hung heavy with drifting spores that swirled gently whenever the wind projectors pulsed. This was the place he had selected long before reaching it, the natural endpoint of the forest's terrain funnels. Everything in the valley, slopes, vegetation clusters, sound channels, and faint magnetic distortions, led to this clearing if disturbed in the right sequence. The enemy patrol, destabilized and forced into narrower paths by the earlier disruptions, would converge here no matter what decisions its commander attempted to make next. Elias stepped onto the clearing's soft soil and scanned the perimeter. Several large fragments of fallen branches lay near the edge, each covered in thick moss. A cluster of stones formed a half-circle around a shallow depression in the ground. Vines hung from the upper branches in loose spirals, swaying gently as though reacting to his presence. He could feel the simulation adjusting, increasing environmental tension. The forest wanted confrontation. He had no intention of giving it one. He crossed the clearing quietly and reached a tall boulder partially draped with tangled roots. He placed his hand against the cool surface, feeling subtle vibrations that signaled the enemy patrol entering the manipulated trap field behind him. The vibrations grew sharper, more rhythmic, as armored units stumbled through the disruptions he had set in place. He could tell by the tempo that the patrol was no longer moving in a clean formation. Units were pausing at irregular intervals, recalibrating sensors, or slowing down in confusion. The entire patrol was being funneled toward him, pushed into a single direction by the forest itself, guided unconsciously by the patterns he had set in motion. Elias crouched beside the boulder, picking up a handful of loose soil. He rubbed the soil between his fingers, testing its moisture. The clearing had a slightly different composition from the rest of the forest. The ground here was softer, more prone to collapse under sudden weight. The simulation designers had intended this to be a dramatic battleground for cadets who wandered too far from their assigned hiding zones. The soft ground could swallow a careless footstep, and the upper branches were positioned in a way that amplified falling debris. Elias understood that he did not need to build anything complex. He only needed to interact with what already existed. He moved toward a cluster of tall reeds near the center of the clearing. The reeds were packed tightly, forming a natural column. He slipped his hands into the base and felt several brittle stalks intertwined with thicker ones. With careful precision, he loosened a small section, allowing the cluster to lean slightly. The shift would be unnoticeable to a passing patrol, but if the reeds were hit by a burst of air or disturbed by heavy movement, the entire bundle would collapse sideways, creating a sudden barrier of dry stalks that could tangle legs and obscure visibility. He stepped back and observed the angle. It was perfect. A faint metallic snap echoed from the trees behind him, followed by a low whir as a drone struggled to correct its altitude. He could hear armored footsteps, steady, forceful, methodical, approaching along the path he had manipulated earlier. The patrol was closing in. He moved to the far edge of the clearing, where two thick branches lay parallel to one another. One was elevated slightly, held in place by a tangle of roots and stones. He placed his foot lightly against the upper branch and pushed until he felt its balance shift. Then he withdrew immediately. The branch now rested delicately on a fulcrum of stones. The slightest tremor from approaching units would cause it to tip and roll, sweeping across the clearing in a low arc that would startle anything nearby. He maintained a calm, steady breath as he moved toward the center of the clearing. He knew the patrol would enter from the northwest, forced by the trap field into a narrow entrance formed by leaning trunks and spore-coated leaves. He positioned himself near a tall patch of ferns that reached his waist. The ferns offered concealment without restricting his view of the clearing. He lowered his body behind them and settled quietly, becoming part of the forest's stillness. Moments later, the shadows at the edge of the clearing shifted. A forward drone entered first, humming softly as its scanners swept the area. Its amber visor flickered as it attempted to interpret the faint traces of movement and heat lingering in the air. It drifted forward, unaware that disturbed vines overhead were still oscillating from earlier chain reactions. The drone's sensors misread the subtle motions as wind interference, causing it to adjust its elevation incorrectly. It rose too fast, striking a branch above it, releasing a burst of spores that clouded its visor. The drone veered sideways, correcting itself only at the last moment before stabilizing again. The distorted data it transmitted would mislead the units behind it. The first armored ground unit emerged next, stepping heavily into the clearing. Its foot pressed against the rim of the soft soil, causing the ground to sink slightly beneath its weight. The unit paused and recalibrated. Elias watched the unit's visor pulse with new readings as it attempted to make sense of the terrain. But the moment the unit lifted its other foot, the soil shifted again, forcing the unit to compensate and step backward, just enough to brush against a vine hanging from above. The vine snapped downward, releasing a cascade of dust and seeds. The dust cloud disoriented the visor, forcing the unit to halt again. The second unit in the formation collided lightly with the first, disrupting the patrol's rhythm. The reeds Elias had loosened earlier trembled as the second unit adjusted its footing. The reeds collapsed sideways, forming a barrier of tangled stalks that obscured the unit's movements. The forward drone misread the sudden wall of reeds as an obstruction created by the forest's environmental shift and adjusted its path in a wide arc, inadvertently directing a third unit into the unstable branch Elias had balanced earlier. The branch tipped and rolled across the clearing, hitting the unit in the shin. The unit jolted backward, stumbling into a cluster of loose rocks. The rocks sent ripples of vibrations through the clearing floor, triggering a collapse in the soft soil directly beneath the first unit. It dropped into the shallow pit with a metallic thud, its visor flashing red as it attempted to regain balance. The other units froze, momentarily confused by the unpredictable sequence unfolding around them. The patrol commander would not understand what was happening. To the simulation's logic, everything appeared to be natural environmental movement triggered by the unit's own actions. Elias remained completely still behind the ferns, watching the chain reaction unfold. He did not move. He did not intervene. The forest was doing exactly what he expected. More spores burst from above as branches swayed under the weight of shifting units. Loose vines lashed downward. Rolling debris crossed the clearing in unpredictable arcs. The patrol's internal communication system would be filled with scrambled data, contradictory readings, and conflicting interpretations of terrain anomalies. One by one, the enemy units fell into states of confusion, disorientation, or immobilization. Some stepped into soft soil pockets and sank. Others were blinded by spores or obstructed by collapsing reeds. The patrol no longer resembled a coordinated force. It resembled a series of malfunctioning machines trapped in a chaotic environment. Elias waited until the clearing fell silent, except for the faint electrical hum of the stunned units. Only then did he rise slowly from behind the ferns. He stepped lightly across the clearing, moving between defeated machines without touching them. His movements were so quiet that even the remaining functional sensors struggled to detect him through the haze of disrupted data patterns. He reached the far end of the clearing, slipped between two roots, and vanished back into the deeper forest. He did not look back. Behind him, the enemy force lay neutralized, defeated not by weapons, not by direct combat, but by the forest itself guided into motion by his silent design. The battle had ended without a single strike. He had remained unseen, unheard, and untouched. The simulation recorded the patrol as incapacitated, but it would not find a trace of human involvement beyond the faint imprint of his boots, moving calmly toward the extraction point. Elias left the clearing behind him with the same silence he had carried through the entire trial. The forest around him shifted subtly as he moved, its artificial light adjusting from the deep emerald tones of the inner valley to the softer greens that indicated proximity to the extraction perimeter. The air grew cooler, touched by faint currents from the dome's atmospheric processors. He followed the contours of the terrain, stepping lightly to avoid disturbing the moss or leaving compressed impressions in the soft soil. His breathing remained steady, controlled by habit rather than necessity. He knew the simulation tracked movement, heat, and sound, but he also knew how to slip into patterns the system interpreted as environmental noise rather than human presence. As he advanced toward the extraction point, he became aware of the faint hum of a distant projector, one that marked the boundary where the simulation softened its environmental density. This zone existed to give cadets a psychological sense of safety after the trial, signaling the end of hostile engagement. For most cadets, reaching this zone meant sprinting desperately, lungs burning, hands trembling from fear or exhaustion. For Elias, it was simply another space to pass through. He slowed near a row of tall, thin trees that formed a natural barrier around the extraction clearing. From behind the trunks, he could hear voices carried by the simulation's sound filters. The alien cadets were already gathered there, though he could not yet see them. Their tones carried tension. Sharp breaths, nervous hisses, quiet muttering. None of them understood exactly what had happened. None of them knew why the enemy patrol had suddenly collapsed, or why scanners had momentarily shown erratic data spikes across the valley. And none of them had any idea where Elias had been since the trial began. He stayed behind the tree line for a moment, listening. One cadet spoke with frustration, her voice tight with disbelief. She insisted the enemy had malfunctioned. She argued that no cadet could have caused the disruption. Another cadet countered weakly, pointing out that the simulation rarely malfunctioned at that scale. A third cadet whispered that he had not seen Elias since the deployment drop and that no one had heard him retreat or hide. The murmurs spread quickly, their uncertainty feeding itself. Elias recognized the tone, not anger, not panic, but bewilderment. Every cadet had entered the trial assuming the human would be at a disadvantage. Now the only question they had was whether he had escaped, failed, or done something none of them could understand. Elias stepped out from behind the last tree and entered the clearing. The cadets turned at once, surprised by the sudden appearance. Ral stood closest to him, his scales dulled by stress. He opened his mouth to speak, then closed it again as though unsure how to address the human who had vanished for the entire trial. The other cadets shifted uncertainly, unsure whether to question him, confront him, or ignore him. None approached him. Elias walked toward the center of the clearing without altering his pace. His steps were calm, his posture relaxed, his face unreadable. He looked tired only in a subtle way, the kind of fatigue that came from intense focus rather than physical strain. He did not speak. He did not explain. He simply took his place among the cadets and waited for extraction as though nothing unusual had happened. The extraction craft arrived with a low hum that rippled across the clearing. Its silver hull glided through the simulated sky, casting long shadows as it descended. The landing thrusters activated with a soft hiss, flattening the grass below. The ramp extended, and Commander Serac stepped out with a rigid expression that failed to hide his confusion. His visor flickered with the latest simulation data. Elias recognized the signs of a commander attempting to understand how an entire patrol had been neutralized without combat signatures or detectable interference. Serac scanned the cadets before resting his gaze on Elias. The commander's expression remained stern, but his antennae twitched in a subtle gesture that revealed his uncertainty. He addressed the group with firm authority, announcing that the simulation had recorded an unprecedented sequence of environmental disruptions and that the patrol had been incapacitated without a single strike from the cadets. He added that sensors had lost track of one participant for most of the trial. His gaze remained fixed on Elias when he spoke this last sentence. Elias kept his expression neutral. He offered no explanation, no gesture, no sign of pride or guilt. He simply listened as though the information had nothing to do with him. His silence made several cadets shift uncomfortably, unsure what to think. Serac broke the tension by instructing everyone to board the craft. The cadets obeyed quickly. As they filed up the ramp, some glanced at Elias with caution, curiosity, or confusion. Rahl hesitated for a moment, as though debating whether to speak, but he ultimately chose not to. Elias boarded last, stepping into the hold with steady movements. Inside, Serac reviewed the simulation logs on a holographic display. The projected patterns showed the patrol's descent into confusion, the environmental chain reactions, and the chaotic collapse inside the clearing. The data made no sense from a command perspective. The logs showed that the forest had acted against the enemy as though it had been manipulated intentionally, yet the system registered no unauthorized construction, no illegal tools, and no direct engagement. Everything appeared natural, too natural to be coincidence. Serac studied Elias's calm posture, then looked back at the data. His voice was quiet when he finally spoke. "Cadet Ward," he said, "your absence during the trial is noted. Do you have a statement before I finalize the report?" Elias raised his eyes slightly, meeting the commander's gaze. His voice was steady, untroubled, almost casual. "I obeyed the order to hide, sir." The cadets looked at him with disbelief. Serac's antennae twitched again in subtle frustration. For a moment, the commander seemed ready to demand more, but Elias's tone contained no arrogance, no defensiveness. It was simply the truth delivered in the cleanest form possible. Serac could not challenge the statement without contradicting his own instructions. He exhaled slowly and dismissed the cadets with a gesture. As the craft ascended, the simulation dome shrank below, its lights dimming to indicate the trial's closure. The cadets sat in uneasy silence. Elias closed his eyes briefly, allowing his mind to settle. He did not need recognition for what he had done. He did not seek an audience or approval. He had acted according to his own principles, understanding the terrain and using the environment as his ally. The outcome mattered more than the method. The Academy would analyze the logs for days, searching for answers that would never be explicitly recorded. Rumors would spread, cadets would speculate, and instructors would debate. Some would claim the forest malfunctioned. Others would swear the human had performed something impossible. The truth would linger somewhere between the lines, known but unspoken. When the craft finally docked at the Academy platform, the cadets filed out slowly, casting glances at Elias as though he carried a secret none of them could unravel. Commander Serac watched him with a mixture of caution and respect. He said nothing, but his silence carried weight. Elias stepped onto the platform, inhaled the clean artificial air, and walked forward alone. His footsteps echoed softly against the metal floor. He left behind no explanations, no confessions, and no footprints for others to follow. He had hidden, just as he had been ordered, yet he had shaped the entire battlefield behind the veil of that obedience. In the weeks that followed, the story of the human who vanished during the trial became part of the Academy's unofficial lore. Some cadets whispered that he had moved through the forest like a phantom. Others believed he had discovered ways to confuse the simulation itself. No one could agree on the details. But one truth remained constant. The enemy patrol had fallen without a fight, and the human who had done nothing visible at all had walked away without a trace. He had obeyed the order more perfectly than anyone could have imagined, turning hiding into a victory the instructors themselves could barely understand. And from that moment forward, the Academy learned to look at Elias Ward not as an outlier or a disadvantage, but as someone whose silence could become a strategy, and whose disappearance could become a force more decisive than any weapon.